Cades Cove, located in the Great Smoky Mountains of Tennessee. This location is the most visited location within the most visited national park in the United States. From the arrival of the first settlers of European descent in 1818, Cades Cove has been a mostly agricultural community until the establishment of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park in 1934. According to the account of former Cades Cove residents, Dolores Abbott Coda and Judy Abbott Hill, in their book, Cades Cove as It Was, in 1850 there were 685 residents within 132 households inside of Cades Cove. By the 1920s, only 550 people remained. Former Cades Cove resident Durwood Dunn documented the controversy caused due to Cades Cove being included within the boundaries of the park proposal. From 1923 to 1927, as the idea for the founding of the park was presented, Cades Cove residents were assured that their private homes would not be overtaken by the park. However, through eminent domain, the properties were eventually seized as the residents were forced to sell their private properties for the forming of the national park. Some were willing to sell, however many others reluctantly gave up their homes and their land. The feeling of deception has left a bitterness among the former residents and their descendants that has lasted throughout generations. This short historical tour of Cades Cove focuses on the buildings that were preserved in Cades Cove and added to the National Register of Historic Places in 1977. Each of these buildings were preserved, rebuilt, or restored to provide the unique appearance of a 19th century frontier farming community.
John Oliver was a War of 1812 veteran. He fought under the command of General Andrew Jackson in the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. In 1818, John and his wife, Lorena Fraser Oliver, along with her daughter Mary, who was known as Polly, became the first permanent white settlers of Cades Cove. The cabin that remains is believed to be the oldest building within Cades Cove, although it was the second cabin Oliver built. Oliver's descendants resided in the cabin until its inclusion in the park. The cabin has been restored to the 1828 structure and serves as an example of the typical log structure of this area during this era. John Oliver helped organize the first church in Cades Cove in 1827. This church became known as the Primitive Baptist Church. The original church was a log structure built in 1832 that stood on the rise of the ground at the rear of the present building. In 1836, William Tipton deeded the land where the church presently stands to the Baptists. The current, more modern building was constructed in 1887 to replace the log structure. Church life played an important role in the life of Cove residents, as many of the people were of a religious nature. Events such as weddings, funerals, and other activities took place within the Cove churches. The Primitive Baptist Church specifically is an important component of Cades Cove history. During the Civil War, the congregation remained pro-Union and was forced to cease services from August 1862 until June 1865 due to North Carolina rebel guerrilla fighters regularly raiding the area. One church member, Russell Gregory, was murdered by the rebels. The Primitive Baptist Church was the most prominent church within Cades Cove, as the leadership of the community during times of crisis were typically members of this church. They also were known for caring for the welfare of the entire community. Unlike the other churches in the Cove, the Primitive Baptist Church was unwilling to disband due to the establishment of the national park. Through a court fight in 1940, they secured the right to maintain their property and cemetery with a yearly lease, and they maintained their membership records into the 1960s. Much of Cades Cove history is contained in the church's cemetery and recorded on grave markers, as many people lived and died in the Cove without ever leaving. At one time, there were two Methodist churches in Cades Cove. The church that remains today is the Southern Methodist Church that is ironically located on the northern end of the Cove. The Methodists were active in the Cove from as early as 1823 to 1824 due to the early circuit riding preachers that covered the Tennessee area after the manner of Bishop Asbury. They were, however, not as fast as the Baptists to construct a building. Their first building was constructed in 1840. It is said it was of a very crude nature. It is also said the current frame building was built in 100 days in the year 1902 for $100 by future minister John McCampbell. The congregation of this church remained small. In 1891, Cades Cove resident Isaac P. Martin stated the church only had a handful of people. This church often shared revival services with the Primitive Baptist Church, and the congregates were very active in community life. The Missionary Baptist Church was formed in 1839 through a church split. 13 members of the Primitive Baptist Church dissented over division mostly regarding missionary work, although the issue of ultra-Calvinism and church organizational structure were also factors. The church initially used the primitive Baptist and Methodist buildings to meet for worship. The membership remained small and mostly inactive throughout most of the 19th century. Congregants remained below 20 prior to the Civil War. From October 1862 to 1865, the church did not meet due to what they referred to as the awful horror of war. Again, between 1880 and 1889, no services were held. 1893 was the year of turning point for the church, as a well-known evangelist by the name of Thomas Sexton held a revival that resulted in the addition of 20 new members and the construction of a building. The building was a rough log structure that was located on a hill on Hyatt Lane in order to be visible to all Cove residents. The current frame building was constructed in 1915 to allow space for the growing congregation. This site is the Elijah Oliver Complex. Elijah Oliver was the son of John and Lorena Oliver. He served as a deacon and clerk of the Primitive Baptist Church for 37 years. His cabin was considered large by Cades Cove standards and was used for church meetings during winter months. The cabin is typical of a prosperous southern Appalachian farm home. In addition to the cabin, 4 structures remain that were essential to 19th century farm life. Prior to refrigeration, a smokehouse located close to the home's kitchen was important in order to cure and preserve meats. Pork was a primary part of their diet. A spring house was also important during the era prior to refrigeration, if a person was fortunate enough to live near a spring. In this building, milk, butter, and other food that needed to be kept cold were stored. Corn was important for both the residents' diet as well as for feeding the stock. A corn crib was located between the home and the barn to store the corn in order to provide both purposes. The construction allowed for air circulation in order to prevent spoilage. The barn allowed for hay storage as well as shelter for livestock. The construction and architecture of the Elijah Oliver barn is a typical example of a 19th century barn. This location is the Becky Cable House. There are varying accounts regarding the early history of the structure. One account states John P. Cable built this house for his daughter Becky. Another account states Becky and her brother Dan bought the house from Lisa and Greg, who operated a general store out of the building. Becky Cable was a spinster that lived her entire 96 years of life as a Cades Cove resident. She raised her brother Dan's children after he and his wife became incapacitated. She also tended the farm by herself, as she was known as a hard-working mountain woman that never wasted a minute. One Cove resident recalled seeing her use a double shovel plow pulled by a mule. The house that remains today was originally located on the bank of Mill Creek on the right side of the road past Cable Mill. This house and several outbuildings have been relocated to the current location as a convenience to visitors. The outbuildings have been placed much as they were in the original location. The Becky Cable House is believed to have been the first frame house built in the Cove, as well as the first structure with a coat of paint. There are 6 outbuildings listed on the National Register of Historic Places. As was common on 19th century Appalachian farms, there is a corn crib, 2 barns, and a smokehouse. In addition, 2 unique structures are located in this area. There is a blacksmith shop, which was very important for any frontier farming community. Although not preserved, the local iron forges played a key role in the blacksmith work. Forging interest was shown in the minerals of Cades Cove as early as the 1820s. John P. Cable moved to Cades Cove in 1865. He opened this corn and wheat mill in 1868, and it served as a social gathering spot and place of reconciliation for the community following the Civil War. This mill is the only grist mill with an overshot wheel that remains in the park. The mill was restored in 1936 and 1951 and is still operational as periodic demonstrations are presented. This location is the Henry Whitehead Cabin, located off Cades Cove Loop Road on a primitive road named Forge Creek Road. The original rough-hewn log home was built by David Shields for his widowed sister. She later married Henry Whitehead, and with the help of his 2 oldest daughters built the new home from 1895 to 1896. The 2 sisters cut and sawed the white pine logs, planed the joists, and molded the bricks by hand. Dovetail notching, a common 19th century construction technique to lock logs in place, is exemplified by this structure. Upper notches are slanted out to drain water from the joint. The cabin was located in the center of the vegetable and cornfields in order to be near their work and to better protect the property. The location is also near natural resources such as wood and water. A smokehouse is also preserved at the site. The 3rd oldest settler in Cades Cove is recorded as being Peter Cable. This house he constructed exhibits some of the finest workmanship of Cades Cove building. Dan Lawson married Peter Cable's only daughter and took over this farm after Cable's death in 1866. According to Durwood Dunn, Lawson is the only individual in Cades Cove to approach entrepreneur status following the Civil War, as he obtained land holdings, owned a general store, and operated the post office. In addition to the preservation of the smokehouse, a granary is also preserved. This stout structure was used to store grain from year to year. A barn also still remains on the site, although it is not recorded on the National Register of Historic Places inventory. The Tipton Oliver Complex is one of the most photographed locations within Cades Cove, specifically the Cantilever Barn. This home is an example of a large Cades Cove farm home. Although it is referred to as the Tipton Place, the house was known as the William H. Oliver Home to Cove residence. The house was built by a carpenter named Jackie Stevenson for Colonel J.W. Hamp Tipton, who had the home constructed for his daughter Louisa Catherine and her husband Pat Dunn in 1875. Oliver moved to this home from the Carter Shields place in 1887 after Dunn passed away and his widow left Cades Cove. There are several structures located on this site in addition to the house and barn, including a blacksmith shop positioned away from the home in order to provide space for equipment and parking, a corn crib, a wood shed, and a smokehouse. This location also preserves an apiary. Sorghum and honey were the only sweeteners readily available, and a structure such as this was necessary to protect the valuable beehives. The final structure on Cades Cove Loop Road preserved through the National Register of Historic Places is the Carter Shields Cabin. This home once belonged to George Washington Shields, who was also known as Carter Shields. He was one of 21 Cades Cove Union volunteers during the Civil War and was wounded by a cannonball during the conflict. This cabin is preserved due to being an example of a typical late 19th and early 20th century southern Appalachian dwelling with excellent mountain craftsmanship.
I hope you enjoyed the short tour of Cades Cove sites listed on the National Register of Historic Places. Thank you for watching.